There are things in this world worse than dying. The ancient world understood this better than we do. They had words for it. Fates that made death look like mercy. The Greeks called it a living death. The Romans had their own term. The Persians? They didn't need a word for it. They perfected it. If you were a queen, a princess, a woman born into power in the wrong kingdom at the wrong time, the Persians had something waiting for you. Not the executioner's blade. Not the slave market. Something that took longer. Something that hollowed you out from the inside while keeping you alive to feel every moment of it. This is not a story about battle. This is about what happened after. When the swords were cleaned. When the fires stopped burning. When the conquerors walked through your palace doors and decided your fate. Because the Persian Empire, from 550 to 330 BC, stretched across 3 continents. They conquered kingdoms from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. From the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. And everywhere they went, they left the same mark. Not just on maps. On people. Royal women in the ancient world were more than wives and mothers. They were political assets. Symbols of legitimacy. Living connections to divine right and royal bloodlines. Every kingdom knew this. Every conqueror knew this. Most empires had a simple approach. Kill the king. Ransom the queen. Distribute the daughters as prizes or sell them as slaves. Harsh, yes. Brutal, absolutely. But it was over. One way or another, your fate was decided quickly. The Persians did something different. Something most historians gloss over because it doesn't fit neatly into stories about great kings and epic battles. They kept you. Not as a slave in the traditional sense. Not as a prisoner rotting in some dungeon. They brought you into the royal court. Gave you rooms in the palace. Fed you. Clothed you. Kept you alive. And then they began the process of making you disappear. Not your body. Your identity. Your past. Your future. Everything that made you who you were. They called it integration. But that's not what it was. It was political captivity that lasted decades. Forced assimilation that erased languages, religions, customs. Identity erasure so complete that by the time you died, often 40 or 50 years later, there was nothing left of the woman you had been. You were buried under a Persian name. In Persian soil. Surrounded by people who never knew you existed before the conquest. And your children? They grew up Persian. Speaking Persian. Worshipping Persian gods. Looking at you with eyes that saw a stranger. That was the system. Efficient. Calculated. Designed not just to defeat kingdoms, but to erase them entirely through the women who should have carried their memory forward. So when we ask what the Persians did to the wives of defeated enemies, we're not talking about one act of cruelty. We're talking about a lifetime of it. Stretched across generations. Documented in administrative tablets that tracked these women like inventory for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. Living as a destroyed trophy. Watching your world vanish while you remained. Breathing but buried. Some fates are worse than death. The Persians proved it. And the evidence is carved in stone, written in clay, buried in the ruins of Persepolis. Let's talk about what that looked like. Because the details matter. And the details are worse than you think. The system had rules. Unwritten at first, then codified. By the time of Darius the Great, it was policy. When a city fell, the separation happened immediately. Royal children torn from their mothers within hours. The boys, if old enough to remember, rarely survived the first year. The girls were kept close, but not to their mothers. Raised by Persian nurses. Fed Persian stories. The mothers learned quickly what survival required. When the King of Kings entered a room, you did not speak unless spoken to. And you certainly did not speak in the language of your dead kingdom. Clay tablets from Persepolis list violations. One mentions a woman from Lydia, nameless, who was overheard singing to herself. The song was in Lydian. Her rations were cut by half for 6 months. The notation is clinical. As if documenting grain inventory. Persian robes replaced native dress. Your garments were catalogued, sometimes displayed in the treasury alongside golden cups. Your mother's dress treated as spoils of war. Fire temples dominated Persian cities. Attendance was not optional. Better food, better rooms, occasional glimpses of your children, all contingent on compliance. The eunuchs watched. Always. They reported everything. A word in the wrong language. A refusal to bow low enough. A moment of tears during a Persian holiday. And letters? None. No captive woman sent or received correspondence from her homeland. The isolation was complete. In 546 BC, Cyrus the Great crossed into Lydia. King Croesus consulted the oracle at Delphi, received his famous prophecy, and marched to war believing the gods favored him. He was wrong. Sardis fell. Croesus became legend. Some say Cyrus spared him, others say he was executed. The accounts contradict. But his daughters? The Greek sources agree. They were taken to Susa, absorbed into the household. And they stayed there. 40 years later, during Darius's reign, Greek travelers mention Lydian women still present. Still alive. By then they would have been in their 50s. They had spent most of their lives in Persia. One historian notes these women no longer spoke Lydian fluently. They had forgotten words. The rhythm of their mother tongue replaced by Persian cadences. The Lydian language itself was dying. And the women who should have passed it to their children couldn't. They were forbidden. But the Persians didn't stop at captivity. They understood that control required roots. They married these women to Persian nobles, governors, military commanders, men whose loyalty was absolute. The children that resulted were the point. A child born to a Lydian princess and a Persian satrap wasn't quite Lydian anymore. But he carried the blood. He could claim legitimacy if needed. A puppet king. A bridge between conquered and conqueror. And his mother had to raise him. Had to watch him grow into a man who served the empire that destroyed hers. In Babylon, after Cyrus entered in 539 BC, King Nabonidus was captured. But his daughter's fate is documented. Enigaldinana had been a high priestess of the moon god Sin, a position of immense religious authority. After the conquest, Persian texts list her as the minor wife of a Persian-appointed governor. Her religious authority stripped. Her title gone. She had a son. His name appears in cuneiform records spanning 2 decades. He held a regional post, loyal to Persia. The texts describe him as half Babylonian, son of Enigaldinana, but raised under Persian law. A servant of the empire. She lived to see him reach middle age, to see her son enforce Persian policy on Babylonian citizens. To understand her bloodline had been turned into a tool. That's the trap. Your children survive. They are healthy, educated, given opportunities. But they are not yours. The women couldn't teach the old prayers, couldn't pass down the stories, couldn't sing the songs their mothers sang. One tablet from Persepolis lists a violation. A Babylonian woman caught teaching her daughter a hymn to Ishtar. The punishment isn't specified, but it was recorded. Someone reported her. The second generation was born into this. They never knew their mother's homeland as anything other than a name. By the third generation, the forgetting was complete. Ration lists from Persepolis span 30 years. Same names appearing year after year. Foreign women. Lydian. Median. Babylonian. Egyptian. Tracked with bureaucratic precision. One woman, listed only as the Carian woman, appears in records for 28 consecutive years. 28 years of barley, oil, wine rations. When her name stops appearing, there's no notation. She simply vanishes. Dead, likely. Buried somewhere in Persia under a name we'll never know. These women had no voice. No record keeper. They existed to be forgotten. If you believe their stories deserve to be told, subscribe to Crimson Historians. Because somebody has to remember what history tried to erase. But captivity wasn't just isolation. The Persians understood theater. Humiliation, delivered publicly, sent messages that echoed across empires. In the Persian court, rank mattered. At the top stood Persian queens. Below them, daughters of Persian aristocracy. And far below them, the foreign women. It didn't matter if you had been a queen. That title died when your kingdom did. Administrative records show women who had ruled cities listed as servant of the household or woman of foreign origin assigned to lower chambers. And when the court gathered for ceremonies, the hierarchy was on display. You bowed. Full prostration. Face to the ground. Before women who would have bowed to you in another life. Nowruz, the Persian New Year, was the worst. Tribute arrived from every corner of the realm. Gold from Lydia. Incense from Arabia. Grain from Egypt. The harem women were required to attend. Required to wear Persian robes. required to smile as representatives from their homelands brought gifts to the king who conquered them. One Greek account describes a Nowruz celebration during Xerxes' reign. Among the women present, several were clearly not Persian by features or bearing. They stood silent while tribute from their former kingdoms was paraded before the throne. Watching gold from your father's treasury presented to your captor. Hearing your native language spoken by ambassadors who don't recognize you. Or worse, who do, and say nothing. Some ceremonies required more than attendance. Foreign women served wine, presented dishes, performed tasks that in their former lives would have been beneath them. It wasn't about the task. It was about the message. You are no longer what you were. In 525 BC, Cambyses II invaded Egypt. Pharaoh Psamtik III couldn't hold the kingdom. Memphis fell. The pharaoh was captured. Herodotus recounts what happened next. Cambyses wanted to break Psamtik. Wanted him to beg, to rage, to give the Persians justification for harsher measures. So he orchestrated a procession. Psamtik's daughter was dressed in rags. Given a water jug. Made to walk through Memphis with other Egyptian noblewomen, all dressed as servants. Her father was forced to watch. Chained, surrounded by Persian soldiers, positioned where he couldn't look away. Herodotus writes that Psamtik remained silent. Face blank. He didn't cry out. But when an old friend appeared in the procession, now reduced to begging, Psamtik broke. That's when the tears came. Not for his daughter's shame, but for the totality of the collapse. The Persians understood. Individual suffering is one thing. Watching your entire world unmade? That's different. And the daughter? She didn't die that day. She was taken into the Persian household. She lived. Because that was the point. Death would have been mercy. This wasn't isolated. Before male relatives were executed or exiled, they witnessed the fate of their female family. Break them psychologically before removing them physically. A broken man doesn't inspire rebellion. And it worked. Territories that witnessed these displays remained pacified. Cooperation increased. But the deepest cut wasn't physical. It was spiritual. The Persians were Zoroastrians. And while they tolerated other faiths in the broader empire, the royal household was different. Women in the king's house attended fire temple ceremonies. Regularly. Participation was documented. Absence noted. Tablets from Persepolis mention converted women of the court. These women had abandoned their ancestral gods. Or appeared to. For a woman raised to worship Ishtar or Amun-Ra, this was obliteration. Religion was identity. Connection to ancestors. Now you knelt before a fire altar, reciting prayers in a language learned in captivity, to a god you didn't choose. Your children never had a choice. They were raised Zoroastrian from birth. The gods of their mother's people became myths. One tablet records an incident. A Babylonian woman found teaching her daughter a prayer to Marduk. The punishment isn't described. Only that it was administered and recorded. Even private devotion was monitored. Even a mother's whisper could be weaponized. And names. They took those too. You were given a Persian name. Your birth name filed away and never used again. You answered to a new name. Your children grew up never knowing what you were really called. A burial site near Persepolis contained graves that stood out. The remains were genetically distinct from the local population. The burial goods suggested high status. But the inscriptions were purely Persian. Foreign women. Buried as Persians. Their origins erased even in death. One grave contained a woman buried with a small clay figurine hidden in her robe. The figurine was Babylonian. A household god. Smuggled into her tomb by someone who remembered. It's the only trace of who she had been. When the Ionian Greek revolt failed in the 490s BC, the punishment was swift. Leaders executed. Cities garrisoned. Noblewomen taken. Greek sources mention women from Miletus, Ephesus, Chios. Absorbed into the empire. One woman, the Miletian, appears in Persian records for over 30 years. Rations. Assignments. Movements within the palace. By the time she died, Miletus had been rebuilt. None of them knew her name. There's a contrast worth noting. Artemisia of Caria, a Greek queen, fought for Persia at Salamis. She was an ally. She retained her title. Her autonomy. Her fleet. The captive Greek women had none of that. The distinction was absolute. Allies were partners. Captives were property. Some captive family lines are documented for 60 years. 2 generations. Women who entered as young adults, had children, died of old age, still in Persia. The forgetting didn't take 1 lifetime. It took 2. The Persepolis treasury tablets contain thousands of entries. Among them, lists of foreign women of the household. Same names appearing year after year. 20. 30. One Elamite woman appears across 34 years. 34 years. Tracked like livestock. When the names stop, there's no ceremony. Just absence. And in the burial grounds, Persian graves. Persian rituals. Persian inscriptions. The women who spent decades longing for home were buried as if Persia had always been home. That's the final cruelty. Not just that they couldn't go back, but that history itself forgot they ever wanted to. In the ancient world, death had rules. Codes that governed how warriors, kings, and royalty faced their end. The Greeks had their concept of kalos thanatos. Beautiful death. Honorable death. A warrior falling in battle, weapon in hand, protecting his people. That was glory. The Romans understood the same principle. Defeated generals fell on their swords rather than face capture. It wasn't cowardice. It was dignity. Control over your final moment when everything else had been taken. And royalty? They had the clearest obligation of all. If your city was about to fall, if capture was certain, you ended it yourself. You denied your enemy the satisfaction. You preserved your honor and spared your family the shame. History is filled with these moments. Queen Dido of Carthage, facing invasion, built a funeral pyre. Cleopatra chose the asp over Roman chains. The wife of the Gaulish chieftain Vercingetorix took poison when the Romans breached the gates. Suicide wasn't seen as weakness. It was the last act of sovereignty, the final refusal. But the Persians denied that option. Not through force, initially. Through architecture. Through surveillance. Through a system designed to keep you alive whether you wanted to be or not. There are administrative tablets from Persepolis that use a specific phrase. Women under special observation. The term appears dozens of times across different years, different captives. Special observation meant guards stationed outside your quarters at night. Meant meals brought by attendants who stayed while you ate. Meant anything sharp, anything that could be fashioned into a weapon or a tool for self-harm, removed. One tablet mentions increased security measures for 3 Median women following an incident. The nature of the incident isn't described. But the response is detailed. Additional guards. Restricted movement. Mandatory supervision during all waking hours. They had tried something. And failed. Greek sources are more explicit. Herodotus mentions a captured noblewoman from Ionia who threw herself from a palace balcony. She survived the fall, badly injured. Persian physicians were ordered to heal her. The account notes she was kept under watch day and night afterward. The message was clear. You don't get to choose when this ends. Because a dead captive serves one purpose. A living captive serves a dozen. And the Persians were nothing if not efficient. Think about what that means psychologically. In most forms of suffering, there's an endpoint you can imagine. Execution has a date. Enslavement might lead to earning freedom. Even torture eventually stops when the torturer gets bored or you die. But this? No timeline. No defined end. Just years stretching ahead of you with no horizon. And hope makes it worse. Because occasionally, very occasionally, ransoms were negotiated. A captive princess returned home after 5 years, 10 years. It happened. Rarely, but it happened. So you wait. You comply. You bow and smile and attend the ceremonies because maybe this year, maybe this month, someone will come for you. And then another year passes. And another. And the hope doesn't die quickly. It erodes slowly, like water wearing down stone, until one day you realize you've stopped waiting. That's when the real death happens. Not your body. Your will. Your children are the cruelest reminder. You watch them grow. Watch them stop responding to your native tongue because they prefer Persian. Watch them light incense at fire temples with genuine devotion, not compliance. Watch them become strangers who happen to share your blood. And you age. In a land that isn't yours. Speaking a language that still feels foreign in your mouth after 20 years. Knowing that when you die, if they bury you at all, it won't be in the way your people bury their dead. No proper rituals. No ancestral tomb. Just a Persian grave with a Persian name. The tablets give us numbers. Not complete, but enough to see patterns. Average documented captivity for royal women ranges between 15 and 25 years. That's not an estimate. That's based on ration records showing the same individuals year after year. But some cases stretch much longer. One woman, identified only by her origin as Bactrian, appears in records spanning 43 years. She would have entered the system as a young woman, died elderly, spent her entire adult life in Persia. And here's what makes that worse. She outlived the war that captured her, outlived the king who ordered it, outlived most of the generation that remembered her kingdom as independent. By the time she died, Bactria had been part of the Persian Empire for so long that young Persians didn't remember it being any other way. She had become a relic of a conflict no one cared about anymore. And still, she couldn't leave. Several graves near Persepolis contain women who died in their 60s and 70s. Genetic analysis confirms non-Persian ancestry. Grave goods suggest they maintain some status. But the burial practices are purely Persian. They died in Persia, were mourned in Persian, buried according to Zoroastrian custom. Whatever they had been before, they died as Persians, whether they wanted to or not. So why? Why go to all this trouble? Because the Persians had done the math. And this method was cheaper, more effective, and more sustainable than any alternative. Military occupation is expensive. You need garrisons, supply lines, constant vigilance against rebellion. And even then, occupied territories remain volatile. But if you control the royal family, you control legitimacy. You can install a governor who's technically one of them. Half Persian, half local. Acceptable enough to prevent riots, loyal enough to prevent rebellion. And the mother of that governor? She's in Persepolis, under watch. A living insurance policy. Her son knows that any betrayal doesn't just endanger him. It endangers her. That's leverage you can't buy with swords. And the deterrent effect was powerful. Every neighboring kingdom could see what happened to the families of those who resisted. Not execution. Not enslavement. Something slower. Something that erased you over decades. That made surrender more attractive. And when kingdoms surrendered early, they were treated better. Not well, but better. Faster integration. Fewer restrictions. The possibility, however slim, of eventual return. The Persians documented this. There are administrative records comparing the treatment of early surrender territories versus prolonged resistance territories. The differences are stark. Women from kingdoms that surrendered quickly appear in higher status household positions. Their children receive better postings. Their rations are more generous. Women from kingdoms that fought to the bitter end? Lower positions. Harsher restrictions. Longer surveillance periods. It was a calculated gradient of suffering, designed to incentivize surrender. And it worked. Look at the expansion rate of the Persian Empire. Between 550 and 530 BC, under Cyrus, they conquered at an unprecedented pace. Most kingdoms surrendered after minimal resistance. Compare that to the Assyrian Empire a century earlier. The Assyrians were more brutal in the immediate term. Mass executions, deportations, cities burned. But they faced constant rebellions. Constant warfare. Their empire was exhausting to maintain. The Persian Empire, for all its darkness, was stable. Rebellions were rare. Territories stayed pacified. Because the punishment for resistance wasn't death. It was watching your family line become a tool of the empire. And that threat kept most kingdoms in line. The administrative efficiency is staggering. The tablets show a system that tracked thousands of individuals across decades with minimal resources. A handful of scribes. A network of eunuch guards. Routine ration deliveries. It was sustainable. And sustainability meant it could continue indefinitely. That's the genius of it. And the horror. Because this wasn't passionate cruelty. It wasn't rage or vengeance. It was policy. Systematic. Calculated. Designed to function like a machine. And for over 2 centuries, it did. The women trapped in it were never the point. They were the mechanism. Components in a system that prioritized control over conquest, psychology over swords. And when the system finally ended, when Alexander burned Persepolis in 330 BC, the women still held there were simply absorbed into Macedonian administration. Different empire. Same fate. Because once you've been unmade, it doesn't matter who owns you. If this history unsettles you, it should. These weren't statistics. They were people. Subscribe to Crimson Historians. Someone needs to remember what empires try to bury. We want to hear their voices. The women themselves. What they thought, what they felt, what they whispered to each other in the dark corners of the harem. But there's almost nothing. Captive women didn't write. Or if they did, it didn't survive. And that absence isn't an accident. Literacy in the ancient world was limited. Royal women might learn to read, but writing materials were controlled. Papyrus, clay tablets, ink, these things were tracked, recorded. And anything written by a captive would have been seen as dangerous. What if she wrote to sympathizers back home? What if she passed information? What if her words inspired rebellion? Safer to deny her the tools entirely. So what we have are fragments. Ghosts in administrative texts. A name here. A notation there. A single line in a Greek historian's account that mentions the women taken from Sardis without elaborating. And sometimes we have descendants. People interviewed generations later who carried stories passed down from grandmothers who never spoke their native language aloud but whispered it in dreams. One Greek historian, writing in the 4th century BC, mentions meeting a man in Athens whose grandmother had been a captive in Susa. She'd been released in old age, part of a diplomatic exchange. By then she'd been in Persia for over 30 years. The historian writes that she rarely spoke. When she did, it was in Persian. She had forgotten most of her Greek. Her grandson said she used to wake up crying, calling out names no one recognized. Names from before. That's all we get. A glimpse through a crack in the door before it closes again. But silence tells us something too. The absence of their voices in the record is itself evidence. These women were erased so thoroughly that even their words were taken. We can reconstruct some of their daily reality through archaeology. The palace complexes at Persepolis and Susa have been excavated extensively. The harem quarters are identifiable. They were spacious, well ventilated, located in secure areas of the palace, away from public spaces. The rooms had painted walls, tiled floors, fountains. By ancient standards, they were luxurious. But the architecture reveals something else. Limited exits, narrow corridors, guard stations at every junction. The quarters were designed as much to contain as to comfort. Ration records give us more detail. Women of the royal household received daily allotments. Barley, wine, dates, oil, meat on festival days. The amounts varied based on rank, but even the lowest-ranked foreign women received more than common labours. They weren't starving. They weren't living in squalor. And that makes it worse. Because suffering people can understand. But this? You had food, shelter, even occasional luxuries. You had no right to complain. No justification for despair. Your cage was gilded. And everyone kept reminding you how fortunate you were. Compare that to free Persian noblewomen. They moved through the palace with relative freedom, hosted gatherings, participated in court politics, had influence, agency, voice. The captive women had none of that. Same palace, same material comfort, completely different existence. One ate well in a home, the other ate well in a prison. And the difference between those two things is everything. The second generation is where the trauma becomes visible in the records. Not because they speak directly, but because their confusion leaks through administrative language. There's a tablet from the reign of Darius that lists a man applying for a regional governorship. His credentials are outlined. His father's name, his mother's name, and then a notation, mother of Lydian origin. Father Persian noble. Candidate expresses loyalty to the throne but has requested information regarding Lydian customs for administrative purposes. Read between the lines. This man didn't know his mother's culture. Wanted to learn it. Not for personal reasons, the request is framed as professional. But you can feel the question underneath. Who am I? Where do I come from? Another record mentions a dispute over inheritance. A woman described as daughter of a Babylonian woman of the household is contesting her legal status. She argues she should be considered fully Persian. The case drags on for years in the administrative archives. She's fighting to be accepted. Fighting to belong. Because she doesn't fit cleanly into either world. And some of these children never saw their mother's homeland. They grew up in Persia. Heard stories, maybe, but stories filtered through pain and loss. Stories their mothers couldn't bear to tell in detail. So the homeland became myth. A place that existed more in imagination than memory. One Greek account mentions a Persian official of mixed heritage visiting the city his mother had come from. He was middle-aged by then. His mother had died years earlier. He'd been sent on administrative business, nothing personal. The account says he walked through the city and felt nothing. It was foreign to him. More foreign than Persia. He left after 3 days and never returned. That's the legacy. Displacement so complete it spans generations. You're not Persian, but you're not anything else either. You're a gap. A space between identities. Now let's talk about scale. Because individual stories hide the enormity. The Persian Empire ruled for approximately 220 years. In that time, they conquered dozens of kingdoms. Not all at once, but steadily. Conservative estimates suggest at least 200 royal women entered this system over that span. Daughters, wives, sisters of defeated kings. 200 women. That's the minimum. Some scholars argue the number could be twice that when you include nobility just below royal status. And the average captivity? 15 to 25 years. Some less. Some far more. Do the math. That's thousands of years of cumulative suffering. Thousands of years of women living in captivity, raising children they couldn't fully claim, dying far from home. And that's just the first generation. The second generation multiplies that. Each captive woman might have 2, 3, 4 children. Those children carry the trauma, the confusion, the fractured identity. By the third generation, you're looking at thousands of people across the empire whose ancestry includes these captive women. People who carry that history in their blood, even if they don't know the stories. Generational trauma doesn't need words to survive. It lives in silence. In the things families don't talk about. In the gaps in the family tree. And the Persians? They kept expanding. Kept conquering. Kept feeding women into the system. By the time Alexander arrived, there were women in the Persepolis harem who had been there for 40 years alongside women who'd arrived the year before. Multiple generations of captivity existing simultaneously. When Alexander's soldiers burned Persepolis, some of those women died in the flames. Some escaped into a world that had no place for them. Some were simply absorbed into the Macedonian system. Either way, their stories ended. But the consequences didn't. There are families in modern Iran, Iraq, Turkey, Greece whose genealogies, if traced back far enough, include these women. They don't know it. The names are lost. The stories are forgotten. But the blood remembers. Even when memory doesn't. The palace at Persepolis stood for centuries. Its ruins still stand today. You can walk through the harem quarters. See the rooms where these women lived. Touch the stone walls they touched. But you can't hear them. The stone doesn't echo with voices. The empty rooms don't whisper secrets. And maybe that's the final cruelty. We have the architecture of their suffering. We have the administrative records of their existence. But we don't have them. Not really. Just shadows. Names without faces. Stories without endings. And the silence where their voices should be. For centuries, we got this story wrong. Not completely wrong. The Greek historians mentioned captive women. Referenced the Persian harem. But they wrote from the outside looking in, often decades after the fact, filtering everything through Greek cultural assumptions. And for a long time, that's all we had. Herodotus. Xenophon. Ctesias. Historians who never set foot in the palace quarters. Who never read a Persian administrative document. Who heard rumors and shaped them into narratives that made sense to Greek audiences. Then, in the 1930s, archaeologists began excavating Persepolis systematically. And they found something unexpected. Thousands of clay tablets. Tens of thousands. Administrative records preserved in collapsed buildings, baked hard by the fire that destroyed the palace. It took decades to decipher them. The script was Old Elamite, used for bureaucratic purposes in the Persian Empire. Linguists worked through the 20th century, slowly translating ration lists, payment records, personnel assignments. And buried in that mundane paperwork was the truth. This wasn't anecdotal. It wasn't the cruelty of individual kings. It was policy, documented, tracked, maintained across multiple reigns with bureaucratic precision. The tablets don't editorialize. They just record. But the pattern they reveal is undeniable. Women identified by foreign origin. Tracked for decades. Listed alongside livestock and grain stores in supply inventories. Modern scholarship has had to revise its understanding entirely. What the Greeks described as occasional practice was actually systematic operation. What seemed like personal cruelty of specific rulers was inherited administrative procedure. More systematic than anyone understood. More calculated. More efficient. And when you compare it to contemporary empires, the Persian approach stands out. The Assyrians, a century before, were brutal in ways the world remembered. They impaled enemies. Skinned captives alive. Deported entire populations. Their cruelty was immediate, visceral, designed to terrorize. But it was also expensive. It required constant military presence, constant suppression, and it bred constant rebellion. The Assyrian Empire exhausted itself maintaining control through fear and force. Egyptian captivity practices were different. When Egypt conquered, they took prisoners. But captivity was usually temporary. Ransom negotiations were common. Prisoners were often released as part of peace treaties or diplomatic exchanges. The Greeks and their city-states had their own approach. Enslavement or ransom. Captured royalty had value. You could sell them back to their people or sell them in slave markets. Either way, the situation resolved relatively quickly. The Persians invented something new: permanent royal detention without enslavement. You weren't property to be sold. You were a political asset to be maintained indefinitely. And it worked better than any alternative. From an administrative perspective, the math is cold but clear. Military occupation of a conquered territory costs enormous resources. Soldiers need pay, food, equipment. Supply lines are vulnerable. Garrisons breed resentment. But if you control the royal family, install a half-Persian governor with blood ties to the conquered people, and keep his mother under supervision in Persepolis, you achieve compliance with minimal ongoing cost. A handful of guards. Rations for the captive women. Administrative overhead to track them. That's it. Compare that to maintaining a military garrison for decades. The Persian method was vastly more efficient. And that efficiency is what sustained the empire for 220 years. One of the longest-lasting empires in ancient history. Stable. Relatively peaceful internally. Rebellions were rare. Because the cost of rebellion wasn't just military defeat. It was generational suffering for your family. And everyone knew it. This is the cruelty of rational, systematic oppression. Not rage. Not sadism. Just calculated policy designed to achieve maximum control with minimum expenditure. It's efficient. And that makes it worse. Because you can't appeal to mercy. You can't hope for the oppressor to tire or lose interest. The system doesn't need emotion to function. It just runs. Modern psychological warfare uses the same principles. Indefinite detention without trial. Isolation from family. Identity erosion. It's documented in 20th and 21st century conflicts. The Persians pioneered it. They proved it works. And the blueprint is still in use today. So let's come back to where we started. The question underneath everything. What's worse than death? Death is a moment. Pain, terror, the final breath. And then nothing. The suffering ends. You're released. But this? This was decades of waking up in a place that reminded you daily of everything you'd lost. Decades of compliance. Decades of watching your children become strangers. Decades of slow erasure until you weren't sure anymore what was real, the woman you had been or the woman they'd made you. That's not one death. That's 1,000 small deaths. Daily. 4 years. And you survive them all. Because survival is mandatory. The cruelty isn't in the killing. It's in the forced continuation. The denial of any exit. Memory becomes the only dignity left. The ability to hold on to who you were, even if no one else remembers. Even if your own children don't believe you. But memory fades. Time erodes it. And eventually, you forget details. The exact shade of your mother's eyes. The melody of a childhood song. The sound of your name in your native language. And when memory goes, what's left? This matters today because systematic psychological oppression didn't end with the Persians. It evolved. Became more sophisticated. We need to recognize it. Not just in ancient history, but in contemporary practices. Indefinite detention. Cultural erasure. Forced assimilation. Identity destruction. The tools change. The mechanism remains. And we need to recognize invisible suffering. The kind that doesn't leave visible scars. The kind that's easy to ignore because the victims aren't screaming. They are silent. Compliant. Surviving. But survival isn't the same as living. There are thousands of stories lost to time. Women whose names we'll never know. Whose faces are gone. Whose voices were silenced so completely that even their silence is almost forgotten. We owe them more than indifference. We owe them acknowledgement. Recognition that their suffering was real, even if history tried to bury it. Picture this. An elderly woman lying in a palace room in Persepolis. She's in her 70s. Her hair is white. Her hands shake. She's been here for 50 years. Arrived as a young woman. Watched her children grow up speaking Persian. Watched her grandchildren born into a world where her homeland is just a name in administrative documents. Her children visit occasionally. Dutiful. Kind, even. But they call her by her Persian name. They don't know the name her mother gave her. She's dying. She knows it. And she knows where they'll bury her. In Persian soil. With Persian rites. Under the Persian name. Not the name she was born with. Not in the land she came from. Not according to the customs of her people. She'll die a stranger to herself. And be buried as someone she never was. This happened. Not once. Hundreds of times over 2 centuries. Worse than death isn't hyperbole. It's historical fact. Documented. Verified. Undeniable. The Persian genius was understanding that you don't need to destroy the body to break a person. You just destroy the spirit. Slowly. Methodically. Over decades. And you keep the body alive to prove you can. These women lived and suffered so we could have history. Not intentionally. They didn't choose to be lessons. But they are. And their silence across millennia deserves our voice now. Because if we don't speak for them, no one will. Crimson Historians doesn't hide from history's darkest corners. We excavate what others ignore. If you want the truth, uncomfortable, documented, real, subscribe. Because history without honesty is just propaganda. And comment below. Do you think living as a captive queen was truly worse than death? Let's discuss what these sources really tell us. Because these aren't just stories. They're evidence. And evidence demands conversation. The tablets are still being translated. New discoveries still being made. There's more to this story. More names buried in clay. More women waiting to be remembered. And we'll keep digging. Keep translating. Keep telling the truth, no matter how dark it gets. Because that's what they deserve. And that's what history demands.